9/11, An Architect's Guide, a three-part series. Today is Thursday, December 19th, 2019. I'm Richard Gage, AIA, member of the American Institute of Architects and founder of Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. We're a 501c3 nonprofit organization representing a growing body of now more than 3,000 architects and engineers signed on to the petition demanding a new investigation into the destruction of all three World Trade Center skyscrapers on 9/11. Last week, we presented part 2, the Twin Towers explosive destruction. This is part 3, the Twin Towers and extreme heat, in which we'll be looking at the evidence of very high temperatures and incendiary chemical reactions involved in the destruction of these skyscrapers. First, let me introduce you to our operations manager, Andy Steele. Hi, Andy.
Hello, Richard. Hello, everybody. Happy holidays almost, and thank you for tuning in. Just to let everyone know, I'm here to help with any technical glitches, which do happen from time to time. Also, we'll be happy to take your questions at the end of the course. You can submit them in the questions and information form online at ae911truth.org. I'll also be watching the YouTube stream and the Facebook post on our Facebook page for any interesting comments or questions related to the material. So with all of that said, back to you, Richard.
Thanks, Andy. And just so people know something about my background, I was responsible at a local firm here in the San Francisco Bay Area for the construction documents for these $3 and $10 million gymnasiums and the construction administration for this $125 million high school. More recently, though, before launching full-time into this important outreach effort, I had similar responsibilities working on this $400 million mixed-use project in Las Vegas with 6 blocks of retail, mid-rise office space, parking structure, altogether about 1,200 tons of fireproofed steel framing. I now work full-time educating architects and engineers using the material in this course to help people all around the country learn about what really happened at the World Trade Center towers. 3,000 architects and engineers. We're going to be asking you to join them. It's actually like 3,200 now. So we use the scientific method in the West for 100 years or so. We have a question in this case. How did the towers come down? Well, we do some background research, make some observations, and construct a hypothesis. That's our best guess as to how the towers might have come down. Jet planes maybe brought it down. Maybe it was the ensuing fires or explosions that happened afterward. Maybe it was controlled demolition, which we'll be showing you evidence for today. And all of the hypotheses are laid out in a rational order, if you will. We don't exclusively focus in on one particular hypothesis, as we'll find that NIST did. We lay aside, theoretically, our financial or political obligations and pursue the objective scientific study. That's what it's all about. We test it with experiments. We analyze the results. We draw conclusions. If the hypothesis is corroborated, we report the results in an open, transparent manner so all can build on the body of the work that we're doing. We don't hide the work, for instance, as we discovered in part 1 of this series, NIST hiding its computer input data, refusing to release it to those architects and engineers who are tasked with ensuring the public safety. Instead, they said it might jeopardize public safety were we to release this information, which is quite ludicrous, actually, and tragic for the science of the study of how these towers came down. If the hypothesis is not corroborated, what do? We go back. We find a hypothesis that is corroborated by the computer results, the experiments, until we have a hypothesis that is indeed corroborated. So with that in mind, let's do some background research. And discover some of the forces that do destroy buildings. Fire is certainly one of them. It moves through a building every 20 minutes or so. That's all the fuel there is in a fire. And if it moves on looking for fresh new fuel sources. So when a building does come down, it's a chaotic event, a very natural, organic process, if you will. Not that we've ever lost before 9/11 a high-rise building due to fire, but say in a wood frame building, it would fall over the path of least resistance, not straight down to the tons of structure beneath the fire. So even in steel buildings, they built 8-story buildings out of these fires and out of steel and set 2,000-degree fires in them. What happens? Well, they behave just like the other steel frame fireproof buildings. And then this one wasn't even fireproofed, and it didn't fail, even with 2,000-degree fires. The beams began to sag, and we had no failure of the structural steel connections, even when the building is not fireproofed, like the Twin Towers and Building 7 were. Now, even buildings, again, that aren't fireproofed, they don't often fail. They have failed, unfireproofed buildings, particularly in factories where there's a huge fuel load. But the study says that this building form is inherently stable due to the highly redundant nature of the structural steel framing. So what about buildings that have failed, in this case, due to natural causes? I'll give you a close-up of these, so you won't have to see my face here as much. Anyway, we have, did we really jump forward? There we go. Buildings that fell due to earthquakes. And we have a recognizable building, even though it's damaged, it's recognizable as a building. It doesn't fall like a house of cards. The columns and beams are not severed one from another. The concrete is not pulverized to a fine powder. So remember this, because we'll find that all of those features were found in all 3 of the skyscrapers at the World Trade Center. So indicating that they're not natural. We'll look at that. These buildings were blown up. We have thick, billowing, enormous pyroclastic-like clouds expanding rapidly in cauliflower-shaped forms due to the intense heat from the chemical reactions of the explosions. There's a solid edge that is expanding outward also. It's a very thick cloud full of the pulverized building materials. And we have witnesses that hear sounds of explosions. They see flashes of light. If we have these features, we know we have explosions. We saw plenty of these features in last week's webinar in part 2 of this series, 9/11, An Architect's Guide. So so keep this in mind too, because we do see these features in the Twin Towers quite prominently. So explosions can be harnessed quite effectively to bring down buildings. There's only a handful of companies in the world that can do this. It's quite a science, placing those shaped cutter charges against thousands of columns and beams in the building and setting them off in a very precise order to bring a building down in the manner that we see here, so that it's fairly controlled, if that's what they want to achieve. In fact, there's a set of features, let's look at them, associated with controlled demolitions. There's a sudden onset of destruction, usually at the base of the structure, not always though. Feature number 2, there's a straight down symmetrical collapse, often, but not always. Sometimes they want to do it differently, because there's a patterned removal of column supports. And feature number 4, resulting in a free fall acceleration, which can happen quite often in controlled demolitions, and or a little bit slower too. But it's acceleration. It's not deceleration, which is extremely important differentiation between natural collapses, which decelerate, and purposefully set explosively charged collapses, which accelerate because of the lack of resistance from down below. And this results in the feature number 5, the total dismemberment of the structural steel frame, with limited damage to adjacent structures. Of course, that's one of the goals of controlled demolition. And witnesses hear explosions. They see flashes of light. This does not happen in natural collapses. In fact, none of these do. Broken up concrete floors, completely broken up, like pulverized. They don't want to have to go back into a controlled demolition and use jackhammers with these floors at all different angles. Very dangerous work. So feature number 5, there's explosive charges that are visible at many of these floors. These are called squibs, or isolated explosive ejections. Also feature number 10, chemical evidence left behind in the residue. That makes sense. If you have these features, you know you have what? Direct evidence of destruction with explosives. Fire doesn't create these features, any of them really, let alone all of them. So if you have any of them, you know you have evidence of direct destruction with explosives. Fires cause less robust structures to collapse, but asymmetrically, with gradual deformations, following the path of least resistance. So let's look at a few fires that have happened prior to 9/11.
May 4th, 1988, the First Interstate Bank, a 62-story building in Los Angeles, California, suffered a 3.5-hour fire which burned across 5 floors and caused an estimated $200 million of damage. It did not collapse. February 23rd, 1991, the One Meridian Plaza, a 38-story building in Philadelphia, suffered an 18-hour fire which burned across 8 floors. The fire caused an estimated $100 million worth of damage, and 3 firefighters died fighting it. It was later described by officials as the most significant fire of the century. It did not collapse. October 17, 2004, the East Tower of the Park Central complex in Caracas, Venezuela, suffered a 17-hour fire which spread across 26 of its 56 floors. It did not collapse. August 18, 2007, a fire broke out on the 17th floor of the Deutsche Bank building in New York, a building undergoing deconstruction after being heavily damaged by debris from the South Tower on 9/11. Originally 41 stories in height, it had been reduced to 26 at the time of the fire, which lasted 7 hours and affected a total of 10 floors. 2 firefighters died of smoke inhalation. It did not collapse. On 9/11 itself, 5 World Trade Center, a 9-story building east of the North Tower, was engulfed in flames after sustaining heavy damage from falling debris. A number of partial collapses occurred, but the overall structure remained standing. February 9, 2009, the Mandarin Oriental Hotel in Beijing was completely engulfed in flames for more than 3 hours during the Lunar New Year celebrations. The fire affected all 44 floors, igniting fireworks as it burned. 1 firefighter died fighting it. It did not collapse.
No collapse. How about World Trade Center 5? A fire across the street or nearby Building 7 that was fully engulfed in flames. If any of the World Trade Center skyscrapers were to collapse due to fire, we would expect it to be this one, did it? No. No collapse here either. Why don't we have collapses in fire-protected steel frame high-rises? Well, one reason is the steel conducts that heat away, keeping the steel from really ever getting to be 1,200 degrees at its source, a temperature in Fahrenheit at which steel can lose half of its strength and begin to bend. So we don't want that to happen. So we fireproof these beams anyway, just to make sure, with 2 and 3 hour fire protection. Now that's a whole lot more fire protection than the 20 or 30 minutes of fire that can be in any particular area of a modern office building anyway. That's all the fuel there is to burn. Even this is even admitted by NIST, which is an important factor here. As we saw in Building 7, they claim that the fire was hovering around column 79 for over an hour and a half, which completely is betrayed by their own statements on this point. So the columns, 3-hour fire protection, the beams, 2-hour fire protection. That keeps any problem from really ever happening to, at least to the steel itself. But we keep we build buildings out of non-combustible materials. We keep the tenants from bringing in too many combustibles to keep that from becoming a problem. We also fire sprinkler these buildings. In the case of the towers, the fire sprinklers were said to have been damaged when the planes hit the towers. With additional circumstantial corroborative evidence like government documentation, you have to get a permit for a controlled demolition typically. So there's people also who then know about the damage, the impending demolition in advance. There's experts who agree afterward, yeah, that was a controlled demolition. At least those experts without financial or political obligations that might sway their objective opinion in the matter. With video documentation, all this, of course, can be proof of controlled demolition. What we want to do today is apply this model of proof to the Twin Towers, beginning with feature number 1. Is there a sudden onset of destruction? Well, we looked at this last week. And in fact, we also looked last week in this series at patterned explosions of flashes of light heard and seen by hundreds of witnesses. We looked at the straight down, nearly straight down, but fairly symmetrical progression of the destruction outside the footprint, delivering the steel, particularly 600 feet in every direction, with ejections of these materials in squibs, isolated explosive charges going off in both of the towers, 20, 40, 60 stories down. We looked at how fast these buildings came down. 2/3 of free fall acceleration, nearly free fall acceleration, almost as fast as the freely falling debris falling outside. That's how fast these charges are set off, as we saw, going rapidly down the building. The total shattering then of the structural steel frame, which the NFPA, National Fire Protection Association Guide 921 for fire and explosion investigation, says look for as evidence of explosions, and lateral ejection of these freely flying structural steel sections weighing 2 to 4 tons and up to 8 tons each, laterally at 600 feet, destroying the winter gardens that far away, and sent out 60 to 80 miles an hour. Pyroclastic-like clouds of pulverized concrete. So we have incredible heat, which we'll be looking at today in more detail, and pulverized concrete to a powder. All of this we found was direct evidence of explosion, destruction with explosives. None of it was capable of being caused by fire, let alone all of it. So with what we're going to be looking at today is feature number 8. We'll start with there, and evidence of extreme heat. We'll start with these incredible clouds, which the National Fire Protection Association Guide 921 for fire and explosion investigation says, look for thermal effects. What does that mean? Not just the effects of fire. Large volumes of gas and the large amount of heat released in chemical explosions, causing rapidly expanding plumes of hot gases, like we see racing away from the Twin Towers in all of the photographs and the videos, expanding plumes of cauliflower-shaped gases and smoke and pulverized concrete in this case. An incredible, expanding 10 times the volume of the building in just 30 seconds. Takes an incredible amount of energy, not a collapse, to cause this to happen. and not those few small scattered fires that we saw at the time of the collapse, which are diminished and indicated by the thick black smoke. They're oxygen starved, and they're much cooler than 500 or 600 degrees. In fact, NIST says they have no evidence for even hotter fire temperatures than that. It must be something much hotter on the order of this, perhaps. Well, let's see what that might be and what the evidence for it specifically is as we look at feature number 9. And let's go to Massimo Mazzucco's New Pearl Harbor.
Possibly the most important unexplained phenomenon at Ground Zero are the extremely high temperatures registered under the rubble for many weeks after the collapses. On September 16, NASA shot these thermographic images of Ground Zero, indicating unusually high temperatures at the base of the 3 collapsed buildings. Despite the heavy rains of September 14th, the hotspots registered peak temperatures of more than 1,300 degrees under the rubble. 10 days later, the fires kept burning.
What's to explain, Governor, the smoke that still comes out?
There's still fire down below. There is such an incredibly deep pile of rubble, and the tower goes down 5-6 stories underground.
We had ABC crews come back just in the last few minutes and telling us there are still flames coming out of the base of the trade towers.
For the rescue workers, this became an additional burden on their already gruesome task.
Out still on the rubble, it's still, I believe, 1,100 degrees. The guys in boots just melt within a few hours.
On October 8th, the hotspots under the 3 collapsed buildings remained clearly visible. 6 weeks later, as the excavations progressed, the situation seemed only to get worse.
Oh, it's unbelievable. And this is 6 weeks later, almost 6 weeks later. And as we get closer to the center of this, it gets hotter and hotter. It's probably 1,500 degrees. We've had some small windows into what we thought was a core at some point, and it looked like an oven. You know, it was just roaring inside. And it's just a bright reddish orange color.
The consequences of such extreme temperatures were quite visible on the steel that was being extracted from the rubble.
The grapplers were pulling stuff out, big sections of iron that were literally on fire on the other end. They would hit the air and burst into flames, which was pretty spooky to see.
You would create an air pocket by moving steel, fueling the fires underground. But, you know, these underground fires were just like the fires of hell.
If you could make a video of what you perceive hell to look like, from fire shooting up at times, that's what would happen. You would be in the middle of what would look like steel, and then fire just would pop up. Firemen were coming out and ironworkers with their boots literally melted. And then the hose would come over and they would try to put that part out.
I got there.
Charlie Vichers was a supervisor of removal operations at Ground Zero. From PBS's America Rebuilds page, we read, Vichers' crew picked up 40 to 60-foot-long pieces of steel impaled in the pile, where the bottom 20 feet would be glowing red hot. Vichers said, trucks loaded with steel would pass by, and you could feel the back of your neck burning standing 20 feet away. In an article called A Dangerous Work Site, the U.S. Department of Labor wrote, underground fires burned at temperatures of 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. This was confirmed by Mayor Giuliani.
There were fires of 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit below the ground.
The Journal of the American Society of Safety Engineers wrote, thermal measurements taken by helicopter each day showed underground temperatures ranging from 400 to more than 2,800 degrees Fahrenheit. 8 weeks later, and the fires still had not subsided.
You see how this debris is still smoking? That's from the fires that are still burning.
Webinar 9/11.
8 weeks later, we still got fires burning. So, I mean, these things are burning. At one point, I think they were about 2,800 degrees.
11 weeks later, and the fires kept burning.
As recently as the end of November, it was still 1,100 degrees down underneath the rubble.
As November turned into December, ice was noticed in the mornings above the ground, but the debris underneath was still smoldering.
The weird thing was it was very cold when we were up there. I believe it was in the middle of the winter, but the ground wasn't frozen. The ground kind of like bubbled underneath your feet, which was kind of strange to me.
It took until December 19, more than 3 months after the collapses, for the last underground fire to be extinguished.
This is absolutely extraordinary. I mean, what are they saying? Red hot steel being pulled from deep within the pile, says David Scott from Arup Associates. Dripping from the molten steel, says this Bronx firefighter. Saw pools of literally molten steel at the World Trade Center, says the president of the cleanup company. Seeing the molten steel, uncovering red hot metal beams ranging from molten metal, which was still red hot weeks after the event. Molten steel at the heart of the tower's remains. Streams of molten metal that leaked from the hot cores and flowed down. Why are we talking about all this molten metal? Because office fires can't possibly create it. And as you'll see, neither can jet fuel. Metal dripping from a beam. Molten steel beams. The end of the beam would be dripping with molten steel. Mark Loiseau from Controlled Demolition Inc. says, molten steel was encountered primarily during excavation of the debris. There are videotape and still photos of the molten steel being dipped out by the buckets of the excavators. Who says this? A river of steel flowing. Leslie Robertson, World Trade Center structural engineer himself. These are extremely credible witnesses, and his associate, Richard Garlock. The debris past the columns was red hot, molten, running, as we see pouring out of the South Tower minutes prior to its collapse. We know from the color of this material that it's not lead or aluminum. Aluminum doesn't glow bright orange and white hot in daylight temperatures, like this material pouring out of the jaws of the crab claw excavator. And this material in the police museum today, showing that concrete melted and flowed like lava around everything in its path, including this handgun, which is why it's in the police museum today. I didn't even know concrete could melt. It takes 3,200 degrees to melt concrete. Steel members in the debris pile that appear to have been partly evaporated in extraordinarily high temperatures. It takes 4,000 degrees to evaporate steel, 2,800 degrees to melt it. But office fires are only a quarter or half of this temperature. Documented by Abelhausen Astani Ozel, he saw melting of girders in the World Trade Center. He was one of the structural engineers who had access to the Fresh Kills landfill to evaluate the steel before they hauled it away very rapidly, as we'll see in a moment. If you remember the Salvador Dali paintings with clocks that are kind of melted, it's kind of like that. It can only happen if you get steel yellow hot or white hot, perhaps around 2,000 degrees. And he's right. Let's go back to Massimo Mazzucco, get some more insight on this phenomenon.
Another proof of extremely high temperatures reached during the collapse are the twisted and mangled steel beams found at ground zero.
Architects, engineers, people who work with steel, welders have just never seen the level of destruction and the level of deformation of this material in our lives.
You saw steel, some of the thickest steel I've ever seen, bent like a pretzel.
This 8-ton steel I-beam is 6 inches thick. It was selected to be preserved for future generations for the near-perfect horseshoe-like bend formed during the collapse.
I found it hard to believe that it actually bent because of the size of it and how there's no cracks in the iron. It bent without almost a single crack in it. It takes thousands of degrees to bend steel like this.
In fact, the temperature of 2,800 degrees mentioned before is not casual at all, as that's exactly the temperature at which steel melts.
Fascinating. Well, if that's the temperature at which steel melts, then fires can't account for this process. It was actually documented by FEMA in the appendix to their building performance assessment report that came out in May of 2002, where they say that the steel curled like a paper scroll, thinned to almost razor sharpness, a 1-inch column. That doesn't happen by fire. That's why they were fascinated by it and studied it so carefully. Rapid oxidation and sulfidation with melting of the steel. Liquid iron, that's molten iron. Sulfur formed during this hot corrosion attack on the steel. No clear explanation for the source of the sulfur, though. Where would that come from? It's perhaps the deepest mystery uncovered in the investigation, according to the New York Times, and yet it's completely ignored by NIST when they took over the investigation from FEMA in 2002. And it's completely omitted from their report, this presence of sulfur. Well, they say years later, sulfur is present in gypsum wallboard that was prevalent in the interior partitions. What? Gypsum wallboard has inert calcium sulfate, but it's never in 100 years turned around and attacked the steel that it's designed to protect. Experiment is what you use to learn the truth. And putting lots and lots of gypsum wallboard in a 2,000-degree fire, John Cole found in his backyard in Florida that no sulfidation, no attack on the steel from gypsum wallboard. And yet that sulfur smell permeated the World Trade Center. It burned, that smell of sulfur, says John Field, a demolition worker at Ground Zero. What about John Gross, the co-project leader?
First of all, let's go back to your basic premise that there was a pool of molten steel. I know of absolutely nobody, no eyewitness who said so, nobody who's produced it.
But witnesses say otherwise.
You'd get down below and you'd see molten steel running down the channel rails. Like you're in a foundry.
Yeah, like lava.
Like it was lava from a
volcano. Actually melted beams where it was molten steel that was being dug out.
Underground, it was still so hot that molten metal dripped down the sides of a wall.
And the cleanup was very difficult in the beginning. Steel was coming out red in certain areas from the first couple of weeks.
This fused element of steel, molten steel.
And they pulled out the big block of concrete, and there was like a little river of steel flowing.
A river of steel flowing, and yet John Gross says didn't happen. Here he is on the pile, cutting off the very piece of steel that he turned around and gave to FEMA to include, which they included in their Appendix C metallurgical examination. His shadow is all over the evidence. And yet they deny it. The temperatures, according to supporters of the official source, say the fire temps only got up to about 1,200 degrees. Well, that's less than half of what would be required to melt steel. And hydrocarbons and desks and chairs only burn about 1,600 degrees max. And jet fuel, according to ME Petroleum, its manufacturer, says in open air it only burns about 600 degrees Fahrenheit. So it's not the jet fuel. Well, what is it then? Because steel had definitely melted. As you see here, you can tell the temperature of the material by its color. We're up to over 2,500 degrees here. That's the physics of molten materials, molten metals. It is quite handy, actually. So what caused it to melt? NIST says, speculating, again, in a very frequently asked question, which they answered years later on their website. Any molten steel was more likely due to the high temperature resulting from the long exposure to combustion within the pile than to short exposure due to fires or explosions while the buildings were standing. Wait a minute. Let's just look at the laws of physics. Conservation of energy says in a closed system, such as fires burning under pulverized concrete powder in the basements of the World Trade Center, the amount of energy is fixed. You can't create any more energy inside the system. The fires can't somehow get hotter than the capacity of the fuel that it's burning. You can only convert that energy from one form to another. In other words, the heat is dissipated. It's not increased. So what about thermite? Could it have produced all that molten material? Well, what is thermite anyway?
An incendiary used by the military, thermite is a compound of iron oxide and aluminum, which when ignited sustains an extreme heat reaction, creating molten iron. In just 2 seconds, thermite can reach temperatures over 4,500 degrees Fahrenheit, quite enough to liquefy steel. We know that open-air fires cannot burn hot enough to melt steel, but metal had melted at the base of the towers. Appendix C of the FEMA report describes sulfur residues on the World Trade Center steel. The New York Times called this the deepest mystery of all. Sulfur slightly lowers the melting point of iron, and iron oxide and iron sulfide had formed on the surface of the structural steel. Sulfur used with thermite is called thermate, producing even faster results.
Well, maybe we're getting somewhere here, because if thermite were used, it would explain the incredible heat that produces 4,000 degree Fahrenheit temperatures. It would explain the molten iron, elemental iron, not steel. We haven't used steel, iron in 100 years in our skyscrapers. So, but this is elemental iron, which is unexplainable in these quantities at all. So it would be explained by thermite. It also could explain the presence of sulfur, which is added to thermite to become thermate, much more effective at cutting through steel. So we're making some progress. So the National Fire Protection Association Guide 921 says, look for unusual residues that could arise from thermite or other pyrotechnic materials. NIST says, well, we found no corroborating evidence to suggest that explosives were used. Oh, yeah? Why? Then we hear from them a year later. They finally admit in writing, NIST did not test for the presence of explosive residues. You can't find what you're not looking for or won't, but others did. It wasn't that hard to find. Stephen Jones, physicist, nuclear physicist, formerly from Brigham Young University, finds that thermite reactions would produce a characteristic burn pattern, a white, yellow, hot liquid metal, like we see pouring out of the South Tower minutes prior to its collapse, that can't be explained by lead or aluminum. He says it also produced a characteristic, the whitish cloud of aluminum oxide gas, like we see rising off the top of this liquid pouring molten metal, and like we see trailing these freely flying structural steel sections distributed laterally out of the tower back to forward to. Why is this structural steel and all of these pieces of structural steel, as we see in the left photograph of the destruction of World Trade Center 1, trailing thick white smoke clouds? Steel is not flammable, not under conditions of fire or jet fuel. What caused the steel to be burning? Excuse me. 193. We'll add some more interesting slides here for you. I just realized it's absolutely fascinating. Both of the towers, freely flying structural steel sections that we looked at in some detail last week in this series, part 2, from both of these. Well, the signature of thermite would also leave behind a unique chemical evidence, common elements such as iron, aluminum, copper, calcium, silicon. Unusual elements also such as fluorine and manganese left behind. Well, altogether, these elements on the periodic table. Well, somebody sent him a piece of this chunk of meteorite, they called it. They lifted these materials up by the ton, several tons, liquid fused molten iron. And a piece of this was sent to Stephen Jones, physicist, for analysis. He does electron microprobe data, finds, hey, it's predominantly iron, elemental iron, not steel. So he rules out aluminum from the jet planes. It has abundant manganese, so he knows it's not structural steel. It has aluminum, sulfur, potassium also. The molten metal, therefore, is the residue of thermite. What's that doing in this piece of slag recovered from this 40-pound chunk of World Trade Center debris? Not debris, but molten material, which is debris, but very interesting debris. It has manganese and fluorine in abundance. What? Manganese and fluorine? Manganese is from the potassium permanganate, commonly used as an oxidizer in thermite. Fluorine is used in sol-gel type thermite charges. These are very special thermite charges. So he says these are present in the residue and are part of a thermite fingerprint. And it just gets more interesting from here, because we'd have sol-gels would leave something even more interesting, 1,3-diphenyl propane. What? But the analysis of the dust says, according to Eric Schwartz of the EPA, one molecule was present at levels that dwarfed all others. 1,3-diphenyl propane. We've never observed it in any other sampling we've ever done. Gosh, he says it might have been from computers, but we've had many computers burning in office fires and we've never found this stuff. So he sent yet another piece of slag from this sculpture at the International Peace Park in Manitoba, Canada. He does X-ray fluorescence analysis of these samples. What does he find? Aluminum, iron, the ingredients of thermite, along with manganese, sulfur, and others. Wow, this should not be there either. You know, you can make thermite cutter charges in your backyard, as John Cole did. Take a look.
The web was reduced in thickness with gaping holes, thinned to almost razor sharpness, with a Swiss cheese appearance.
Wait a minute, where did I see that? Thin to almost razor sharpness. Oh yeah, in the Appendix C of FEMA, which NIST threw out of the investigation when they issued their report. There are more technically efficient devices that use thermite to break down steel structures in shaped cutter charges, like this one, which issues streams of molten iron in hundreds of milliseconds. Extremely efficient for cutting through much thicker sections of steel framing. And there are devices whose casing itself is made out of thermite, which is quite interesting because all that would be left behind is pools of molten iron, which were found, of course, by the ton. And so what else, though, was found in all of this dust spread river to river across lower Manhattan in a 3-square-mile area? The U.S. Geological Survey, doing studies on the dust in their particle atlas, find billions of previously molten iron microspheres, elemental iron. all the dust samples. They're everywhere. Up to 6% of these samples are found to contain these previously molten iron microspheres. Amounts to about 4 tons by extrapolating from these samples. 4 tons. That's like 150 times the background value of iron in common office building dust. R.J. Lee group did an analysis as well, finding that they were formed during the event, not before, not after. Well, they're so common they are used as a signature component to determine what is World Trade Center dust versus common office building dust or some other dust. That's how prevalent, unique, and unexpected they were. Well, how are they made? Let's do it. In this experiment, just from a small amount, you see thousands of what looks like sparks, but they're molten iron microspheres, which cool and fall into the pan, as you see here. Because molten materials under pressure aerosolize and form into spheres. That's what the surface tension does to them. Well, these would cool and fall with all of the other dust. And could that be what's responsible for the toasting of the tops of these cars? What else could be responsible for this incredible heat? We have something else, though. Another discovery found in the World Trade Center dust that blew the lid off of this cover-up of the crime of the century. 7 separate samples were sent to this team of scientists led by Niels Harrit in Copenhagen, like the one from Jeanette McKinley's apartment across the street from the South Tower, which her windows blew in, filled her apartment full of dust. And she's an artist. She collected this, paid for that decision with her life. She developed brain cancer, unfortunately, tragically, and died. But her sample was also provided. It's one of these. And in all the samples, this team found that the same curious red-gray chips in all the samples. They look like paint, but they come up to a magnet. They're attracted by a magnet. And they get real curious. And they're about a 1/16 of an inch long, each of them. And they zoom in to the red layer and do X-ray energy dispersive spectroscopy and find what? Iron and aluminum. Iron and aluminum. This is key components of thermite. What's that doing in all these dust samples? I mean, these red-gray chips that they found. Well, they get even more curious. Zoom in 50,000 times into the red layer and discover that these are nano-sized particles of iron oxide crystals and aluminum platelets 1,000 times smaller than the diameter of a human hair. How does that happen? They're set in an organic bed of material, oxygen, silica, and carbon. Organic material is what's used in TNT, high energy explosives, for the expansion or the explosive factor, the concussion that results, the high energy wave that knocks things over. See, incendiaries work by means of heat. So thermite is a typical incendiary, but something else is going on here. They historically, in the literature of this, they call it super thermite. It was produced prior to 2001. And the literature shows that when you subject these energetic nanothermite composites to heat, they burst, and they produce at temperatures about 420 degrees Celsius. And when that happens, something else very interesting happens, because the same thing happened here with these 4 samples, including Jeanette McKinley's, and at 420 degrees centigrade, which is about 758 Fahrenheit, they ignite, producing what? Iron microspheres, which are analyzed and are found to have virtually the same chemical composition as the iron microspheres from the World Trade Center dust found by others, including R.J. Lee and the U.S. Geological Survey. So we know where those iron microspheres came from. They came from these chips, as if we didn't know that, because they're found attached to partially ignited red-gray chips, as you see here and here. So it's not a mystery. This is a self-corroborating, repeatable set of experimental data that could be introduced into the courts to put a lot of people away for a long time. Who are those people? I don't know, but we should be looking at the people who make this stuff. It was developed at Lawrence Livermore Lab. It's not, because of the extremely small size of these nanoparticles, the surface volume increases exponentially. And so you have a chemical reaction that happens virtually instantaneously. It's a huge field for the very sophisticated laboratories in the defense sector, the arms industry. It's not made in a cave in Afghanistan. So we don't have too far to look. The Bentham Open Chemical Physics Journal is where this peer-reviewed paper, 24 pages, is published, concluding that the red layer of the red-gray chips is active, unreactive, thermitic material incorporating nanotechnology, and it's highly energetic, pyrotechnic, or explosive material. Needs to be brought in as evidence. So, in fact, as do all 3 of these very uncharacteristic features of controlled demolition in today's case, but it's direct evidence of destruction with explosives and incendiaries, particularly today. No evidence of destruction from fire. Fire can't account for this material. Fires, again, cause less robust structures to collapse, but they do so asymmetrically with gradual deformations following the path of least resistance. Especially these fires are not going to be causing all of this incredible heat that we've been looking at the evidence of today. Even the cumulus release, which gave us the FLIR thermal imaging videos, show temperatures not even exceeding 200 degrees. NIST says, well, we have evidence of some steel reaching 568 degrees, but then they claim that these fires got up to 1800 degrees without any evidence whatsoever. So we looked last week at the testimony of the first responders, the data from the FEMA and NIST reports. We'll take a quick look once again at the official investigations. FEMA getting just $600,000 worth of funding in 2002. But their efforts were hampered, as we saw last week. Bureaucratic restrictions, access to the site, the blueprints, the steel, almost impossible. Prompting Bill Manning, editor-in-chief of Fire Engineering magazine, has good reason to believe that the official investigation blessed by FEMA is a half-baked farce that may already have been commandeered by political forces whose primary interest, to put it mildly, lie far afield of full disclosure. Can you hear a cover up in this? The structural damage from the planes and the explosive ignition of jet fuel in themselves were not enough to bring down the towers. Selling out the investigation. NIST got $20 million of funding finally, with their objective given to them by Congress to determine how and why the World Trade Center 1 and 2 collapsed, and yet they had their own objective hidden on footnote 13 on page 82. The focus of the investigation was on the sequence of events from the instant of aircraft impact to the initiation of collapse for each tower. What? It doesn't actually include the structural behavior of the tower after the conditions for collapse initiation were reached. What? You had 10,000 pages of data and only 1/2 of a page on the events following the initiation of collapse. As we looked at last week, we discovered that they simply say that the large building mass far exceeded the capacity of the structure below to absorb it. Came down essentially in free fall, they say. Floors below were unable to arrest the moving mass. It's not analysis. There's no supporting calculations. It's pure speculation. So structural engineers do this every day for a living, calculate the ability of an upper part to the lower part to resist the collapse by an upper part. It's not rocket science. And they cast doubt on their own theory because we submitted a request for correction, which you can do with federal reports, and asked them all of these questions. They say, we're unable to provide a full explanation of the total collapse of the Twin Towers. Right, that's putting it lightly. We go to the experts then. 100 structural engineers, for instance, of the 3,000 signing on to the petition at AE 9/11 Truth demanding a new investigation, like Ron Brookman, who says it doesn't look anything like a heat-induced gravitational collapse mechanism. Why did the complete collapse of the Twin Towers become inevitable? Why would all 110 stories drop straight down to the ground in 10 seconds, pulverizing the contents into dust and twisted steel? Ed Muniak, fire protection engineer. The fires were weak. NIST reports. The NIST reports confirm that the steel temperatures were low. The World Trade Center collapses have no resemblance to any high-rise fire. Well, surely the steel was preserved and protected in 3 of the most puzzling structural failures, the largest structural failures in modern history. Well, let's listen to one of these structural engineers.
After 9/11, we realized that Port Authority of New York and New Jersey has sent all the steel that we need to study. That's why I'm here to study steel. Has sent all the steel to recycling plant to go to China for recycling. For what? For 15 cents a pound. Just nothing. And all the evidence of steel went to melting pot.
After 9/11, a law was passed requiring that such materials be saved for study.
But too little, too late. It was destroyed, sent to China for recycling, as you heard. Almost all of it, 99.99% of it. Crucial evidence that could answer many questions is on the slow boat to China, says Bill Manning, editor-in-chief of Fire Engineering magazine, showing an astounding ignorance of government officials to the value of a thorough scientific investigation. The destruction and removal of evidence must stop immediately. But it didn't. And easily the 3 largest and most perplexing structural failures in history, starting 2 weeks after 9/11, this steel was carted away to barges, which were sent to China, 400 truckloads a day. This is the illegal destruction of evidence in a crime scene, prompting so many architects, engineers, and more than 1 million others altogether to cry out for a real investigation that can answer the cause of the collapse. But which hypothesis is meeting the evidence for you today? That's the question we're asking you to answer on your comments, for those of you who are live with us. And if you have questions, we're going to be answering those in a moment. But today we've had the features 8, 9, and 10 in part 3 of this 3-part series, 9/11 An Architect's Guide. Last week, part 2, we looked at features 1 through 8 or 7, and we found direct evidence of destruction with explosives in all 10 of them, and some very uncharacteristic features again. No evidence of destruction by fire, and with additional circumstantial corroborative testimony and so forth evidence, we found this to be proof of controlled demolition, prompting more than 3,000 architects and engineers to demand a new investigation, and so many others. So we'll get to your questions. How do we do that, Andy, though? How can people put their questions online?
Okay. Please submit your questions that you might have in the same input form we talked about earlier at ae911truth.org. In the meantime, we'll tell you about some of the ways that you can get involved if now that you're informed you agree that this evidence is quite compelling and warrants a new investigation.
Well, there we go. And you do that right here on this form, as Andy mentioned. While you're there, subscribe to AE 911 Truth. You'll get an email a couple of times a month, and we want to keep you informed of the latest evidence, the latest efforts toward getting a real investigation, such as the Halsey report, which we talked about last week and the week before, on World Trade Center 7 finite element analysis. And get informed on our website also. We have an incredible evidence section with videos and technical papers, all kinds of support for the evidence that NIST has omitted from the official reports. While you're there, sign our petition, especially if you're an architect or engineer. But even there's 20,000 others who have signed our petition demanding a new investigation, supporting those architects and engineers. And donate to us. We're a 501c3 nonprofit organization with doing work all over the country and around the world, getting the word out. We have a staff of 6, and we work all the time on your behalf, those of you who see that this is seriously, the implications of these controlled demolitions is extremely serious for our country. People have to be woken up that we have been taken advantage of in this incredible crime of the century. And so there's one organization at the forefront of all of the work that's being done, particularly, and that's Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. But we need your support. We don't get, as you can imagine, federal grants or corporate grants. It doesn't work like that. Become a member of AE 9/11 Truth. Join the family of sustaining supporters. And volunteer if you are unable to do that. There's ways you can help us on the phone and at home on your computer. Andy, what do we got going now for volunteers?
Well, we got a lot of work going on because for some reason the corporate media doesn't seem to want to help us publicize our Building 7 study, maybe because it proves that we've been right all of this time and they've been spending their time saying that we're wrong. So we have to have volunteers help us do the media's job for it and get this information before Congress, which we'll be talking about later. And there's a lot of effort that goes into that. And the good thing is we've got jobs for every kind of personality out there, whether you're the kind of person who likes to chill out at home and work on the computer, or if you like to pick up the phone, reach out and touch someone, you can do that as well. And even writers as well, people who write for us or people who like to write their own articles. It's great to volunteer with us in that way because we're a great resource to make sure that your articles are fact-checked and you've got all your information lined up to go take that out to the world and spread this information. So how do you get to be a part of all that? You just go to ae911truth.org. You fill out a very short form. We'll get in touch with you and see where you'll fit in best. And just for a few hours of work a week, you'll really be part of something big. So please consider doing that.
Wonderful. And guess what? There's things you can do at home. You can call for a new investigation, reaching out to elected representatives, television, radio, newspaper. Tell everyone you know about this. Screen the DVDs to your friends, family, and colleagues. Share the brochures that are available in our store, 100 of them for less than $10. share them, and also tell people about the computer modeling that you can download the report now. And I'm talking about a 128-page finite element analysis performed by one of the top forensic structural engineers in the country, Professor Leroy Halsey of the University of Alaska, who spent the last 4 years working out the details and pulling the rug out from underneath the NIST claim that Building 7, the third skyscraper that collapsed on 9/11, came down due to office fires. Well, it's completely betrayed by the truth. They found that office fires could not have caused the collapse. They found that Building 7 did not experience a progressive collapse. It was actually a global collapse caused by the near simultaneous failure of its columns. Got a typo in there. I'll fix that for you. And that's one of the reasons why we have all 5 fire commissioners from this New York City, New York area city, demanding a new investigation of the 9/11 events based on the evidence you've been seeing today. It's also why we are going to Congress. How are we doing that, Andy?
Well, this is called the Bobby McIlvaine World Trade Center Investigation Act. It's named after Bobby McIlvaine, who was killed by an explosion as he was entering the North Tower. And of course, that's not part of the official story. So there, by the nature of how he died and the fact that we named the act after him, you've got a great conversation starter for approaching your congressman and demanding justice on this important issue. I mean, Richard has laid out this evidence. It takes 3 webinars, all the evidence that there is, that we at the very least need a new investigation. And that is exactly what this would do. It would create a select panel, can be passed in either house of Congress, that would look into the evidence that we've been talking about today and be the investigation that we never got in the first place. But members of Congress don't do anything unless they feel a lot of pressure from their constituents. So this is how you get involved out there. You go to ae911truth.org/justice. If you only got a few minutes to do something, you can type in your address. It'll generate a letter on your behalf and send it to your members of Congress. If you got more time, you can print out the materials, the act itself, a letter from Richard, a letter from Bob. Go down to your town hall meeting and bring up this issue. It doesn't matter what they're talking about. You go up to the microphone and you ask them, why haven't you supported the Bobby McIlvaine Act, or will you? And that's not limited just to congressmen. If you're meeting up with a presidential candidate at a town hall, you can do that and present that to them as well. We have a guy that does that all the time. The key is to be active and have something to ask for. This is what you ask for right here, and it'll stick in their mind. The Bobby McIlvaine Act, that is what I need to pass. So you just got to put that pressure on them. So please get behind that.
Absolutely. And guess what? We're behind it also. We have our evidence that you've seen today packaged by the Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiry, submitted to the U.S. Attorney in Manhattan, who wrote back and said, yes, I will comply with the law. It requires me to give this to an investigation, a special investigating grand jury, special grand jury. So we have now filed a mandamus action against that U.S. attorney, proving that he's done that or is doing it, and that's pressure. More pressure. Filing a lawsuit against the FBI, stating that they failed to provide in 2015 to the Congress in the 9/11 Review Commission that they had evidence of ours, which you've seen in this series, and they've admitted that they have our evidence, but they didn't give it to Congress. So now it's going to go public and go to them as soon as early 2020 here. It goes again to court. So the FBI's under pressure here with the evidence that we've also packaged in a landmark documentary, 9/11 Explosive Evidence, Experts Speak Out, in which we've assembled 40 high-rise architects, structural engineers, metallurgists, chemists, physicists, controlled demolition experts, all laying out this evidence, and that you've seen in a different format, because these are the experts talking now, which is pretty well done. I'd like to show you just a couple of minutes of this, and we'll get right to your questions. Here we go.
I don't want to be involved in conspiracy theories. There are lots of them. They can go on. We can speculate on that forever. What we really need to know is how those buildings came down.
World Trade Center 7 collapsed because of fires fueled by office furnishings. It did not collapse from explosives or from fuel oil fires.
To undermine scientific integrity is to undermine our democracy.
This is what NIST has done, denied and ignored crucial evidence.
The American people absolutely need the truth of 9/11.
More than 1,500 architects and engineers and 12,000 others, including many scientists, have signed the petition calling for a scientific investigation of the destruction of the Twin Towers and World Trade Center Building 7. The report, issued by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, referred to as NIST, was not valid science.
They're talking about a single columnar collapse or failure that resulted in a total collapse of the building.
Building number 7 descended in free fall for the first 100 feet, which means that there was absolutely no resistance to the descent whatsoever.
So all of the columns really needed to be severed at the same time.
The symmetry is the smoking gun.
NIST has admitted it went into free fall for 8 stories.
You don't need to be an engineer or an architect to see what happened to those buildings.
Dus dit is controlled demolition. Zeker weten. Zeker weten.
What I saw, it was a classic implosion. The center of the core, the penthouse area, starts to move first, and then the building follows along with it.
NIST excluded the documents from FEMA in Appendix C that documented the evidence of melting steel.
In an office fire, you cannot generate enough heat to melt steel.
There were these iron microspheres present in all of the dust samples. They needed to have been formed in extremely high temperatures.
All the characteristics of the microspheres, along with what I see in the attack of the beams that were actually found, tell me that thermite was involved.
In the dust, what we have found is a modern version of thermite, which we call nanothermite.
NIST concedes that they found no evidence for explosives. So then we asked them, well, did you look? And they said, no, we did not look for explosives or residues of explosives.
And in fact, the evidence is overwhelming. Red great crystal.
Scientific research politicized in an effort to advance predetermined ideological agendas.
If this is a crime, I think everybody agrees it's a crime. Evidence was removed from the scene of the crime. You can't do science when you are deprived of the evidence and when your hypothesis is the least valid instead of the most likely. And the most likely hypothesis in the case of Building 7 wasn't even mentioned. This is not science.
No. And that's why you need to pass it around, because science is what we're told it was, and it's the opposite of that. It's a huge cover-up, again, of the crime of the century. You can get this, you can watch this film for free on YouTube, the 1-hour version. The 1.5-hour version with the extended video, Meet the Experts, is available on our website. I encourage you to get it in our online store. So also the Beyond Misinformation 55-page booklet altogether is available for you. We've compiled all the evidence against NIST, basically, but for a new investigation. And it's full size, 8.5 by 11. And then the 2-hour version, where we've crammed these 3 webinars into 2 hours, Blueprint for Truth, It's available also on our website and the shorter version on YouTube, as is the 15-minute documentary made for PBS, narrated by Ed Asner, just on Building 7. Extraordinary film that we have for you there. Hey, let's get to those questions. What about it, Andy?
All right, we've got 2 questions today. First one asks, this is purely speculative, but do you believe that there will be more whistleblowers that will come forward as years go on?
Yes, I do. I am very hopeful because, you know, there's a ground, the ground is saturating with the water tables rising. That's the way I want to describe it. We're reaching critical mass. And as we do, whistleblowers will have more available, trusted sources to blow the whistle at. Right now, you know, who are they going to go to? The mainstream media, which covered all of this up, which is owned just by 6 corporations, 90% of the mainstream media. Who runs those corporations, by the way? It's been found that they're run by those running corporations in the arms industry, the oil industry, the banking industry. So we don't have safe sources for whistleblowers to go to in the mainstream media. And so as it gets safer for elected representatives to talk about these sensitive issues, which right now gets them branded as conspiracy theorists, things will change. And I expect the Halsey report from the University of Alaska to be a key component in that change. We're working on a film right now to publicize the results of that report and the cover-up by NIST. And we're very excited. Dylan Avery's making that film, and you out there who are supporting us have funded that film, and he's putting his heart into it. We've been on calls with him, and he's very excited. Dylan Avery, the maker of Loose Change. So stand by. It's coming out early February, so hold on to your socks. It's going to rock the world out there.
Okay, our next question asks, is NFPA 921 only a guide to find out, actually, let me restart that. Is NFPA 921 only a guide to find out how a fire started or what might have caused an explosion, but only if these reasons are not known? And 9/11 NIST says NFPA 921 was not followed because it was the airplanes that created both fire and 2 explosions. I think NIST used the airplanes and NFPA 921 as an excuse not to question the extreme temperatures and reports of secondary multiple explosions.
I like that speculation, Andy. I think this questioner has nailed it, because the NFPA 921 is the guide for fire and explosion investigation. NIST actually had a hand in developing that early on. So they're clearly aware of it, and its guidelines govern all fire and explosion investigations across our country in buildings. So how do they get out from underneath these requirements to follow it? They simply said, well, gosh, we know what caused the explosion. It was the airplane. Well, wait a minute. There's hundreds of witnesses of explosions. And there's all this evidence, as we've seen today and last week, of explosions and the shattering of the structural steel frame, the incredible heat developed that can't be caused by fire or jet fuel. And damage that's certainly not caused by airplanes, and no evidence of a natural collapse of these buildings whatsoever. The explosive destruction of these buildings was documented quite carefully last week. So I think you answered your own question here, and I really appreciate it. I'll focus on that more in the future too. Do you have anything more to add on that one, Andy?
I think it's a really good point that this person brings up. And even if you don't look into 9/11 beyond remembering it every year and watching a History Channel retrospective, you can still agree that this was a highly sophisticated attack, no matter who you think did it. So the fact that you admitted it's a highly sophisticated attack should show that you go into it deeper than just the airplanes hit it and that caused the fire, and then I don't need to look into anything any further than that because the buildings came down because of those airplanes. Obviously, since it was a highly coordinated thing, you would want to look into the idea that maybe there were also explosives put into the buildings ahead of time. Of course, NIST is not going to do that. And I think it's funny because we know there was a lot of energy put in by intelligence agencies and the media to look at who did this, or rather maybe to tell us who did this after the attack took place. I think if they had put the same energy that NIST put into finding out why these towers came down into that aspect of it, of finding out who did it, we probably would have just heard that some guys took control of some planes somehow. They might have been foreigners, and that would have been the end of it. So I think it just shows a lack of intellectual curiosity from NIST, and this is a really good point brought up.
Right on. It's exactly what it is. Well, great. So we looked today then at part 3, Twin Towers and Extreme Heat, of this series, 9/11 An Architect's Guide. We saw high evidence of lack of heat from high-rise fires, but plenty of heat in pyroclastic-like clouds, molten steel and iron microspheres, thermite, nanothermite. All of that we covered today. And last week we covered part 2, the Twin Towers explosive destruction. And we will again in January. As we start in January with part 1 in this series, World Trade Center Building 7, the first Thursday in January, 1 p.m. Pacific time. I'll be here. Hope you'll send your friends next time. For this entire series. We are all about getting the word out, and we hope you'll share and like this video with your friends so that we can do just that. It'll take a groundswell of public awareness and then outrage that we've been scammed at a colossal level. It's wake up time, folks. And we're doing our part here at Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. We hope you'll do your part too. That's all from me. How about you, Andy?
Happy holidays, everyone. Be safe.
Happy holidays. Yes. We'll see you guys in January. Bye for now.